David Chen had been dreaming about this moment for 3 years. Ever since his college graduation, he'd been saving every spare dollar from his job at the local electronics store. He's putting aside money that should have gone toward a new car or a better apartment. Instead, he kept a small mason jar on his kitchen counter labeled London Fund in permanent marker. Every tip, every overtime shift, every birthday check from his grandmother went straight into that jar, now standing on the sidewalk outside. Buckingham Palace at 7 in the morning, David couldn't believe he had actually made it. The early October air was crisp and filled with the sounds of London waking up. Black cabs rolled past on the street behind him, their diesel engines humming, while double-decker buses carried early commuters to their destinations. The smell of fresh coffee drifted from a nearby vendor cart, mixing with the clean scent of morning dew on the palace gardens. David pulled his worn leather jacket tighter around his shoulders and checked his phone for the 100th time. Changing of the guard ceremony wouldn't begin for another hour, but he wanted to secure the perfect spot. He had studied YouTube videos for months, reading comments from other tourists about the best places to stand, the ideal camera angles, and the exact timing of every movement the guards would make. The palace gates stretched out before him, their black iron bars topped with golden spear points that caught the morning sunlight. Beyond the gates, the famous red brick facade of Buckingham Palace rose majestically, its hundreds of windows reflecting the sky like mirrors. David had memorized the basic facts during his research. 775 rooms, 19 staterooms, a garden that was larger than Hyde Park. But seeing it in person was completely different from any photograph or documentary he had ever seen. A small crowd was already gathering along the fence, mostly other early rising tourists, with cameras and guidebooks. David found a spot near the center gates and leaned against the cool metal, feeling the history beneath his fingertips. These same bars had been touched by millions of visitors over the decades, each one carrying their own stories and dreams. To this famous address, to his left, an elderly Japanese couple was setting up a professional-looking camera on a small tripod. The woman carefully adjusted the lens while her husband consulted a detailed map of the palace grounds. Their methodical preparation reminded David of his own grandfather, who had served in the Pacific during World War II and always spoke with deep respect about military ceremonies and traditions. On his right, family from Germany was trying to keep their 2 young children entertained while they waited. The boy, who looked about 8 years old, kept asking his father when the Red Soldiers would come out. His little sister was more interested in the pigeons that strutted boldly among the tourists' feet, occasionally begging for crumbs from breakfast pastries. David smiled, remembering his own childhood fascination with toy soldiers and castles. His mother used to read him bedtime stories about knights and kings, and he would fall asleep dreaming of living in a palace with secret passages and hidden treasures. Standing here now, those childhood fantasies felt both distant and incredibly vivid. The morning sun climbed higher, casting longer shadows across the courtyard and warming David's face. More tourists began to arrive, and the gentle murmur of conversation grew louder. He heard snippets of French, Spanish, and what sounded like Italian, mixed with various English accents from Scotland, Ireland, and Australia. Everyone seemed to be sharing the same sense of anticipation and excitement. David pulled out his phone to take a few practice shots, adjusting the settings to account for the bright morning light. His hands were slightly shaky with excitement, and he took a deep breath to steady himself. This was it, the moment he had been planning for since he first saw a documentary about the British royals' family 3 years ago. Every late night at work, every skipped dinner out with friends, every time he chose to walk instead of taking a taxi, it had all been leading to this morning. Behind the palace gates, David could see gardeners moving quietly among the flower beds, tending to the perfectly manicured lawns and trimming hedges into geometric shapes. Their movements were unhurried and precise, as if they were performing a daily ritual that had remained unchanged for generations. The gardens themselves were a masterpiece of landscape design. The winding paths that disappeared around corners and fountains that sparkled in the morning light. A police officer on horseback trotted slowly along the front of the palace, his mount's hooves clicking rhythmically on the asphalt. The horse was magnificent, a large black gelding with a glossy coat and intelligent eyes that seemed to survey the growing crowd with professional interest. David watched in fascination as the officer sat perfectly straight in his saddle, his uniform immaculate and his expression alert but friendly. The sound of marching feet echoed faintly from somewhere inside the palace grounds. David's heart began to race. He had read that the guards began their preparations well before the public ceremony, practicing their movements and checking their equipment with military precision. Soon, he would witness one of the most famous traditions in the world, a ceremony that had been performed with virtually no changes for over 160 years. David checked his camera battery one more time and made sure his memory card had plenty of space. He had brought 2 backup batteries and an extra memory card, determined not to miss a single moment because of technical problems. This trip represented not just a vacation, but the fulfillment of a dream that had sustained him through 3 years of careful saving and planning. As the crowd continued to grow around him, David felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought him here. Tomorrow he would fly back to his ordinary life, but today he was living in a fairy tale. The sound came first, a deep, rhythmic drumbeat that seemed to rise from the very stones of the palace courtyard. David pressed his face closer to the iron gates, his breath fogging the metal bars as he strained to see the source of the music. Around him, the crowd fell into an expectant silence, broken only by the excited whispers of children and the soft click of camera shutters. Then they appeared, like something from a living history book. The first guard rounded the corner of the palace, his tall black bearskin hat adding nearly a foot to his already impressive height. The famous red tunic was even more vibrant in person than David had imagined, a rich scarlet wool that seemed to glow against the gray stone background. Gold braiding decorated the front of the uniform in intricate patterns. Brass buttons caught the morning sunlight like tiny mirrors. David's hands trembled slightly as he raised his phone to record. This was better than any movie, more impressive than any photograph he had ever seen. The guard's face was stern and focused, his eyes staring straight ahead with an intensity that made David hold his breath. Every step was measured and precise, his polished black boots striking the ground in perfect rhythm with the military band that followed behind him. More guards appeared in formation, each one a perfect mirror of the others. Their synchronization was flawless. Every arm swing, every head turn, every footfall executed with mechanical precision. David found himself mesmerized by the spectacle, unable to look away even to check if his phone was still recording properly. The crowd around him pressed closer to the fence, and David could feel the excitement building like electricity in the air. A small boy near him tugged on his mother's coat, pointing excitedly at the guards' tall hats. "Mummy, why are they so big?" The child whispered loudly, his voice carrying the wonder that David felt in his own chest. The bearskin hats were indeed impressive towering fur caps that had been part of the guards' uniform since the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. David had read that each hat was made from the fur of a Canadian black bear and could last up to 20 years with proper care. Seeing them in person, he understood why they had become such an iconic symbol of British military tradition. The guards' faces remained completely expressionless, their eyes fixed on some distant point that only they could see. David wondered what they were thinking as they performed this ancient ritual in front of hundreds of fascinated strangers. Did they ever get tired of the ceremony? Did they notice individual faces in the crowd? How long had they been practicing to achieve such perfect coordination? One guard caught David's attention particularly. He was younger than the others, probably in his early 20s, with a determined set to his jaw that reminded David of his younger brother preparing for a big game back in high school. There was something about his posture that suggested this ceremony meant as much to him as it did to the watching tourists, a sense of pride and responsibility that transcended the pageantry. The military band that accompanied the guards was equally impressive. Their red tunics matched those of the guards, and their instruments gleamed in the morning sun. The lead drummer carried himself with particular dignity, his elaborate uniform decorated with additional gold trim and ceremonial chords. The music they played was traditional British military marches, each note crisp and clear in the morning air. David noticed that several of the guards carried rifles held at precise angles across their chests. The weapons looked both ceremonial and functional, polished to a mere shine but clearly capable of their intended purpose. It was a reminder that these men were not just performers in an elaborate show, they were active soldiers, trained, and ready to defend the crown if necessary. The ceremony unfolded with clockwork precision. Guards took their positions at specific points around the palace gates, while others began the formal inspection of the relieving guard. David watched in fascination as senior officers examined each soldier's uniform, checking that every button was properly fastened, every piece of equipment correctly positioned, every detail perfect. A tourist next to David, a woman with a thick Australian accent, was providing running commentary for her teenage daughter. "See how they never break formation? Love," she whispered excitedly. "They train for months to get this right. It's like a dance, but with rifles and 50 pounds of ceremonial gear." The girl nodded, clearly impressed despite her attempts to appear bored. "How heavy are those hats?" she asked her mother, who consulted her guidebook frantically. "It says here they weigh about 2 pounds each," the mother replied. Imagine wearing that for 2 hours in the sun. David found himself eavesdropping on conversations all around him as tourists shared facts and observations. An elderly man from Scotland was explaining the significance of the different regimental badges to his grandson, while a couple from France debated whether the guards were allowed to speak while on duty. The mix of languages and accents created a backdrop of international fascination with this uniquely British tradition. As the ceremony continued, David noticed more details that his research hadn't prepared him for. The way the morning light played across the guards' polished buttons, creating tiny rainbows in the metal. The sound their boots made on the stone, not just the rhythmic marching, but the subtle scrape and shuffle as they turned and positioned themselves. The almost imperceptible movements of their eyes as they scanned the crowd. Maintaining awareness even while appearing to stare straight ahead, the palace itself seemed to come alive during the ceremony. As if the building was as much a participant as the guards themselves. Windows that had been dark suddenly showed signs of movement behind them, and David caught glimpses of palace staff watching from inside. He wondered if any members of the royal family were observing the ceremony from their private apartments. Looking down at the same scene he was witnessing from the street, the crowd had grown significantly since David had arrived, and he felt grateful for his early morning dedication to securing a good viewing spot. Behind him, he could hear frustrated voices of latecomers trying to see over the heads of those in front. Tour guides were lifting small flags and speaking in urgent whispers, trying to keep their groups together in the pressing throng of spectators. David's phone battery indicator flashed red just as the most impressive part of the ceremony was beginning. His heart sank as he realized he had been recording for nearly 40 minutes without thinking about power management. The guards were now performing their most elaborate maneuvers, and he was about to miss capturing the climax of the entire experience. Frantically, he dug through his backpack for one of his backup batteries, but his hands were shaking with anxiety and excitement. The small battery pack slipped from his fingers and clattered to the ground, rolling several feet away from the fence. David watched in horror as it disappeared under the feet of the pressing crowd, lost somewhere in the maze of tourist shoes, and dropped programs. Excuse me, he whispered desperately, trying to squeeze through the tightly packed spectators to retrieve his battery. But the crowd had grown so dense that moving even a few inches required significant effort. People were pressed shoulder to shoulder against the palace gates. Nobody wanted to give up their hard-won viewing position. A middle-aged woman from Ireland shot him an annoyed look as he tried to push past her. "The ceremony's almost finished," she hissed under her breath. "Can't you wait 5 minutes?" But David couldn't wait. This was the moment he had traveled 4,000 miles to see, the experience he had saved 3 years to afford. His phone screen went black, and with it died his dreams of sharing this incredible memory with his friends and family back home. All those late nights at work, all those skipped meals and canceled plans for what? A dead phone battery and a lost opportunity? That's when he noticed something that made his pulse quicken. The main palace gate, the enormous iron barrier. that separated the public from the royal residence was standing slightly ajar. It was barely noticeable, perhaps 6 inches of space where the two massive doors didn't quite meet. David stared at the gap, his mind racing with possibilities. Security guards were stationed at various points around the perimeter, but their attention seemed focused on managing the large crowd of tourists rather than watching for anyone who might try to slip through that small opening. The ceremony was reaching its crescendo, with guards marching in complex formations that drew every eye to the center of the courtyard. David knew it was a terrible idea the moment it entered his head. But the thought persisted, growing stronger. With each passing second, he could slip through that gap, retrieve his battery pack from wherever it had rolled, and maybe even get some incredible close-up photos from inside the palace grounds. He would be quick in and out in less than a minute, before anyone even noticed he was gone. The rational part of his mind screamed warnings. This was Buckingham Palace, one of the most heavily secured buildings in the world. The guards were real soldiers with real weapons, and he was just a tourist with a dead phone battery and poor impulse control. But the emotional part of his brain, the part that had dreamed about this trip for 3 years, began constructing elaborate justifications. He wasn't planning to hurt anyone or steal anything. He just wanted to get a better view, to salvage something meaningful from this once-in-a-lifetime experience. Surely the guards would understand if he explained the situation. After all, he was clearly just an excited tourist, not a security threat. David glanced around nervously, checking to see if anyone was watching him specifically. The crowd was completely absorbed in the ceremony. Cameras and phones pointed toward. The marching guards, security personnel he could see, were all focused on crowd control, making sure people stayed behind the barriers and didn't block the sidewalk. His heart hammered against his ribs as he edged closer to the gap in the gate. The iron was cold and solid under his fingers, worn smooth by decades of London weather. Through the opening, he could see the palace courtyard stretching out like a forbidden garden, its perfect lawns and geometric flower beds even more impressive. From this angle, the sound of military boots on stone grew louder, and David realized the guards were marching in his direction. This was his chance when they passed by. Everyone's attention would be completely focused on them. He could slip through the gate and be inside the grounds before anyone noticed. A bead of sweat rolled down his forehead despite the cool morning air. His mother's voice echoed in his head, all the lectures about thinking before acting, about considering consequences before making decisions. But she wasn't here now, standing in front of the most famous palace in the world with a dead camera battery and a dream that was slipping away, minute by minute. The guards were getting closer, their formation shifting as they prepared to pass directly in front of his section of the fence. David could see the determined expression on the young guard's face that he had noticed earlier, the intense focus that seemed to block out everything except the rhythm of the march and the precision of the movements. David's hand moved almost involuntarily toward the gap in the gate. The metal was surprisingly warm from the morning sun, and he could smell the gardens beyond fresh grass, blooming flowers, and something else he couldn't identify. The scent of history, perhaps, or simply the particular smell of a place where important things happened every day. His phone buzzed once in his pocket as it died completely. The final nail in the coffin of his careful documentation plans. David closed his eyes and took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing thoughts and make a rational decision. But when he opened his eyes again, the gap in the gate seemed wider, more inviting, like a doorway to an adventure that would make up for all the disappointments of the morning. The sound of the approaching guards filled his ears like thunder, and David knew that, in the next 30 seconds, he would either make the smartest decision of his trip or the most foolish mistake of his entire life. David squeezed through the gap. The moment his body crossed the threshold onto palace grounds, everything changed. The sounds of the crowd behind him seemed to fade into background noise, replaced by an almost sacred silence that hung over the perfectly manicured lawns. His sneakers, which had seemed perfectly reasonable for a day of sightseeing, now felt loud and inappropriate against the pristine walkways. It's designed for ceremonial boots and royal footsteps. For the first 10 seconds, David felt like he had discovered a secret world. The palace gardens were even more beautiful from inside, flower beds arranged in patterns that were invisible from the street. Hidden fountains that created gentle music in secluded corners, and pathways that wound between ancient trees, whose branches had shaded kings and queens for generations. He pulled out his phone, momentarily forgetting it was dead, then fumbled for his backup camera. The photos he could take from here would be incredible angles that no tourist had ever captured. Perspectives that would make his friends back home gasp with amazement. Maybe he could even get a shot of the guards from behind, showing the ceremony from their point of view. But as David crept deeper into the garden, trying to stay low behind the carefully trimmed hedges, he began to notice details that made his excitement curdle into fear. Security cameras were mounted discreetly on lampposts and hidden among the decorative ironwork, their red recording lights blinking like angry eyes. Motion sensors were cleverly disguised as garden ornaments, and he suspected that his presence had already triggered silent alarms in security offices throughout the palace complex. The rational part of his mind, which had been shouted down by excitement and dead battery panic, finally found its voice again. What exactly had he been thinking? This wasn't just trespassing. This was trespassing on one of the most secure properties in the world. Home to the British royal family, protected by some of the most elite soldiers and security professionals on the planet. David tried to convince himself that he could still salvage the situation. He would take just one quick photo, then slip back through the gate before anyone noticed. The ceremony was still in full swing, and the crowd was completely absorbed in the pageantry. He could be back among the tourists in less than a minute, and nobody would ever know he had been inside. But as he raised his camera to capture a shot of the palace's private facade, David heard something that made his blood freeze in his veins. The sound of rapid footsteps on gravel, coming from multiple directions. Professional, urgent footsteps that belonged to people who knew exactly where they were going and had serious business to conduct when they arrived. David dropped into a crouch behind a large rose bush, his heart hammering so loudly he was sure it could be heard throughout the entire garden. Through the leaves, he caught glimpses of dark uniforms moving with military precision along the pathways. These weren't the ceremonial guards in their red tunics and bearskin hats. These were security personnel in tactical gear. Were clearly looking for something, or someone. His mouth went completely dry as he realized the magnitude of what he had done. In his excitement and disappointment about his dead phone, he had essentially broken into the home of the British royal family. Not metaphorically broken in, not accidentally wandered into a restricted area. He had deliberately squeezed through a gap in the security perimeter of one of the most important buildings in the United Kingdom. David tried to remember everything he knew about British law and international incidents. Could he be arrested? Deported? Would this end up in the newspapers back home, humiliating his family and destroying his reputation? His grandmother would be mortified if she saw her grandson's mugshot on the evening news. Identified as the American tourist who breached Buckingham Palace security. The footsteps were getting closer, accompanied now by the low murmur of radio communications. David caught fragments of professional jargon: Sector 7, visual confirmation, civilian breach. The words sent waves of panic through his system as he realized that his presence wasn't just noticed, it was being treated as a serious security incident. A bead of sweat dripped from his forehead onto the rich soil beneath the rosebush. And David noticed absurdly that even the dirt in the royal gardens looked more elegant than anything in his apartment back home. The roses above his head were perfect specimens, probably tended by master gardeners who had trained for decades. To achieve such flawless blooms, he was hiding in a work of art, leaving his panicked fingerprints on centuries of careful cultivation through the ornate fence. David could still see the crowd of tourists watching the ceremony, completely unaware of the drama unfolding just yards away from them. Children were still asking their parents excited questions about the guards, couples were still posing for selfies, and tour guides were still reciting historical facts with theatrical enthusiasm. Their London morning was proceeding exactly as planned, while his was spiraling into an international incident. David's phone, despite being dead, still felt like a weight in his pocket, evidence of his tourist status and his innocent intentions. But would anyone believe that he had simply made a foolish mistake in a moment of disappointment? Or would they assume he was part of some elaborate plot a reconnaissance mission disguised as bumbling American tourism. The sound of a radio crackled nearby, and David heard a voice speaking with crisp British authority. Target, located in the Rose Garden, Sector 7. Civilian male, appears to be alone. No visible weapons. Moving to intercept. Target. They were calling him a target. David closed his eyes and tried to think of a prayer. Any prayer from the Sunday school classes his grandmother had dragged him to as a child. But all he could remember were fragments of hymns and the overwhelming certainty that his foolish decision had just transformed him. From a tourist into an international security incident, the footsteps stopped directly behind his hiding place. David knew his adventure was over. "Sir, please stand up slowly and keep your hands visible." The voice was calm, but carried absolute authority, the kind of tone that made disobedience seem not just unwise, but physically impossible. David's legs trembled as he rose from his crouch. Behind the rose bush, his hands raised in what he hoped was a universal gesture of surrender and peaceful intentions. 3 guards surrounded him. But these weren't the ceremonial soldiers in red tunics that the tourists had come to see. These men wore dark tactical uniforms, body armor, and carried weapons that looked decidedly modern and functional. Their faces were professionally neutral, but their eyes missed nothing as they assessed David from head to toe. Taking in his tourist clothes, his camera, and his obvious terror. "I'm sorry," David stammered, his voice cracking like a teenager's. "I'm so sorry. I made a mistake. My phone battery died, and I lost my backup battery in the crowd. I saw the gate was open just a little bit, and I thought maybe I could just ... His words tumbled out in a rush of panic and explanation, each sentence making him sound more foolish and less credible. The lead guard, man in his 40s with steel-gray eyes, and the bearing of someone who had seen everything twice, held up a hand for silence. "Sir, I need you to listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you. You are currently on restricted palace grounds without authorization. For your safety and ours, I need you to follow my instructions exactly as I give them. Do you understand?" David nodded frantically, not trusting his voice to remain steady. His grandmother's voice echoed in his head again. All her warnings about thinking before acting, about the consequences of impulsive decisions. She had always said that his curiosity would get him into trouble someday, but he was sure she had never imagined it would be this kind of trouble. "What is your name and nationality?" the guard asked, pulling out a small notebook. "David Chen. I'm American, from Ohio. Columbus, Ohio." The words came out in short bursts, as if his panic was rationing his ability to speak. "I'm here on vacation. This is my first time in London. I've never done anything like this before." One of the other guards was speaking quietly into his radio, reporting David's information to someone in what was presumably the palace security center. David caught fragments of the conversation. American tourist, no prior incidents. Appears cooperative. The clinical nature of their assessment made him feel like a specimen being catalogued rather than a person. "Sir, I need you to understand the seriousness of what you've done." The lead guard continued, his voice remaining level despite the magnitude of David's security breach. "This is the private residence of the royal family. The barriers and security measures you bypassed are not suggestions. They are absolute boundaries designed to protect both the residents of this palace and visitors like yourself." David felt tears of embarrassment and fear beginning to form in his eyes. I know it was stupid. I wasn't thinking clearly. My phone died right during the ceremony, and I had saved for 3 years to take this trip, and I just panicked. When I realized I wasn't going to be able to record any of it, the guard's expression softened slightly, perhaps recognizing the genuine remorse in David's voice. 3 years? He asked. "Yes, sir. I work at an electronics store back home, and I saved every tip, every bit of overtime pay. This was supposed to be my dream vacation." David's voice broke slightly on the last words, the full weight of what he had done finally hitting him. Not only had he committed what was probably a serious crime, but he had also ruined the trip he had worked so hard to afford. The second guard finished his radio conversation and approached the leader. "Control wants to know his background. Full name, passport number, hotel information, the works." They were running a complete check. David's hand shook as he reached for his wallet. Pulling out his passport and the hotel confirmation he had printed out as backup documentation, The guards examined his documents with professional thoroughness, noting details and relaying information. Through their radio system, David Michael Chen, age 28, employed at Best Electronics in Columbus, Ohio, the lead guard read from his passport. Staying at the Premier Inn near Victoria Station, scheduled to return to the United States tomorrow evening. The mundane details of his ordinary life sounded surreal when recited in the perfect English accent against the backdrop of the royal gardens. David realized that these men were building a complete profile of who he was, assessing whether he represented a genuine threat or was simply a tourist who had made a catastrophically poor decision. "Sir, I have to ask you directly," the lead guard said, his eyes meeting David's with laser intensity. "Are you carrying any weapons, recording devices other than the camera we can see, or any other items that might be considered dangerous or inappropriate?" "No, sir, nothing. Just my camera, my wallet, and my phone. But it's dead." David held his breath as one of the guards conducted a quick but thorough pat-down, checking his pockets and backpack with professional efficiency. The search revealed exactly what David had claimed: a dead phone, a basic digital camera, a wallet with credit cards and cash, and various tourist items like maps, candy, and a guidebook to London. Nothing that suggested any malicious intent, just the typical contents of an American tourist's day pack. Through the ornate fence, the changing of the guard ceremony was reaching its conclusion, and David could hear the crowd beginning to disperse. Tourists were chatting excitedly about what they had witnessed, taking final photos, and consulting their maps to decide where to go next. Their normal, uncomplicated vacation day continued, while his had transformed into something that would probably require legal representation. "Mr. Chen," the lead guard said, closing his notebook, "what happens next depends largely on you. We can handle this as a simple trespassing incident, a foolish mistake made by an overwhelmed tourist, or we can treat it as a potential security breach requiring full investigation and prosecution. The choice is largely dependent on your complete cooperation and honesty." David nodded eagerly, relief flooding through him at the suggestion that this might not end with him in handcuffs. "Yes, sir. Absolutely. I'll cooperate with anything you need. I just want to go home tomorrow and pretend this never happened." The guard's mouth twitched in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "I'm afraid it's not quite that simple, Mr. Chen." David found himself sitting in a small, windowless room somewhere in the bowels of Buckingham Palace, staring at a cup of tea that had grown cold while he waited for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. Ordinary beige walls, fluorescent lighting, and furniture that could have come from any office building in the world. It was hard to believe he was inside one of the most famous buildings on Earth. The door opened, and the lead guard entered, accompanied by a woman in a crisp business suit who introduced herself as Sarah Mitchell from Palace Security. Kind eyes, but the bearing of someone who dealt with unusual situations on a regular basis. "Mr. Chen," she began, settling into the chair across from him, "I've reviewed your case with our security team and spoken with the Metropolitan Police. You're extremely fortunate that this incident occurred during a public ceremony with hundreds of witnesses to your obviously tourist behavior." David's stomach clenched. "Does that mean I'm going to be arrested?" "That depends on how we proceed from here," Sarah replied. "Breaking into the palace grounds is a serious offense under British law. However, we have some discretion in cases where the breach appears to be the result of poor judgment rather than malicious intent." She opened a folder and consulted several documents. "Your background check came back completely clean. No criminal record, steady employment history, and your social media accounts show nothing but excited posts about planning this London trip. Everything suggests you're exactly what you appear to be, an overager tourist who made a very bad decision." Relief washed over David, but he could tell from her tone that there was more to come. "Here's what's going to happen," Sarah continued. "You're going to be escorted back to your hotel, where you will remain until your scheduled departure tomorrow evening. A plainclothes officer will accompany you to ensure you make your flight. You will not speak to any media about this incident. You will not post about it on social media, and you will not contact any news organizations." David nodded eagerly. "Yes, absolutely. I don't want anyone to know about this." In exchange, Sarah said, this incident will be classified as a minor trespass resolved through administrative channels. No formal charges will be filed, no arrest record will be created, and after a probationary period of 1 year, the incident will be expunged from your file entirely. The weight that had been crushing David's chest since the guards found him finally began to lift. He wouldn't go to jail, wouldn't have a criminal record, and wouldn't become an international news story. His grandmother would never have to see his face on television being described as the American who broke into Buckingham Palace. However, Sarah's voice took on a more serious tone. There are some additional consequences you need to understand. David's brief moment of relief evaporated. You are hereby banned from all royal residences for a period of 10 years. This includes Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, Holyrood House, and any other property under royal protection. Additionally, your passport will be flagged in our security system. Any future visits to the United Kingdom will result in additional screening and questioning. 10 years? David would be 38 before he could return to London, and he would carry the invisible mark of his foolish decision every time he traveled internationally from now on. Sarah seemed to notice his expression, and her voice softened. Slightly, Mr. Chen. I want you to understand something. What you did today was incredibly dangerous, not just for you, but potentially for others. The security measures around this palace exist for very real reasons. Our guards are trained to respond to any breach as a potential threat to the royal family. She leaned forward in her chair. You're lucky that your behavior immediately identified you as a confused tourist rather than someone with harmful intentions. If you had acted differently, if you had run when confronted or reached for something in your pocket, this conversation would be taking place in a very different location. David felt sick as he realized how close he had come to a much worse outcome. I understand, he whispered. I'm so sorry. An hour later, David walked through the lobby of his hotel accompanied by a polite but watchful plainclothes officer who introduced himself simply as James. The officer helped David pack his belongings and made casual conversation about David's impressions of London, as if escorting tourists back to their hotels was a perfectly normal part of his day. First time in London? James asked as David folded his souvenir t-shirts. Probably the last, David replied, still unable to believe what had happened to him. Don't be so sure about that, James said with a slight smile. 10 years passes more quickly than you think, and London will still be here when you're allowed to return. That evening, as David sat in his hotel room eating room service fish and chips while James read a newspaper in the lobby, he found himself thinking about the day in a way he never could have imagined. Yes, he had made a terrible decision that would follow him for years to come. Yes, he had turned his dream vacation into a diplomatic incident and embarrassed himself in front of some of the most professional security personnel in the world. But he had also experienced something that no other tourist ever had. He had walked in the private gardens of Buckingham Palace, breathed the same air as kings and queens, and seen the palace from angles that existed in no guidebook or travel blog. The memory was tainted by fear and humiliation, but it was also utterly unique. His phone finally charged, buzzed with messages from friends and family, asking about his trip. David stared at the screen for a long time, trying to figure out how to respond. He couldn't tell them the truth. The agreement with palace security forbade any discussion of the incident. But he also couldn't bring himself to lie about what had been the most intense day of his life. Finally, he typed a simple response. London has been unforgettable. More exciting than I ever expected. The next evening, David sat in his airplane seat watching London shrink beneath the clouds. James, having escorted him all the way to his boarding gate,
The city lights sparkled like jewels against the dark
Thames, and somewhere down there, Buckingham Palace stood guard over its secrets and its perfectly manicured gardens. David pulled out the small notebook he'd been carrying throughout his trip, intending to write down his memories of London before they faded. But when he tried to write about his experience at Buckingham Palace, the words wouldn't come. How could he capture the terror of hiding behind the rose bush, or the strange professionalism of the guards, who treated his panic with such calm authority? Or the surreal experience of drinking tea in a basement room beneath the most famous balcony in the world? Instead, he wrote simply, Some experiences can't be shared, only carried. Years later, David would tell people that his trip to London had been educational and life-changing, which was certainly true. He never mentioned the 10-year ban or the flag on his passport, but he also never forgot the lesson he had learned in the royal gardens. Some boundaries exist for reasons bigger than our personal disappointments. And some mistakes teach us more about ourselves than any success ever could. When David finally returned to London, 13 years later, 3 years after his ban had expired, when he could finally afford another trip, he stood at the same fence where his adventure had begun. Watching a new generation of tourists marvel at the changing of the guard ceremony, his hair was thinner, his face more lined, his perspective dramatically different. This time, he kept his phone fully charged, stayed safely behind the barriers, and took hundreds of perfectly legal photographs. But as he walked away from Buckingham Palace that day, David realized that none of his new pictures would ever be as vivid in his memory as those terrifying, exhilarating moments when he had been on the wrong side of the fence, learning the hardest way possible that some dreams come with consequences we never expect. The foolish move that had nearly ruined his first trip too. London had indeed turned it into a day he would never forget, not because of the photos he had taken or the sights he had seen, but because of the person he had become in the moment when everything went wrong,